So this week we're going to be talking about movements on the left. And when we talk about left, we're talking about essentially left-wing politics, which is generally more liberal than conservative right-wing politics. I'm going to structure this lecture into two categories. Again, structure and agency. In the structural component, we're going to be talking about changes at the governmental level, the structural changes that are taking place from a left-wing perspective. And then on the agency side of things, we're going to be talking about disparate groups of activists that are, in their own way, attempting to change society from the bottom up, as it were. And we're going to begin with the structural side of the lecture in talking about Great Society, the Great Society legislation, which was essentially a comprehensive package of legislation that was attempting to respond to a lot of the protests and demands of activists from the civil rights movement into the Black Power movement. And essentially what transpires is a package of legislation that is responding to the social and economic inequality produced by economic transformation and also extent racism in America. In previous lectures, we talked about three other comprehensive packages of legislation. Beginning in the very beginning of the semester, we talked about Reconstruction, the Reconstruction era, and then in the early 20th century, the Progressive era, and then in the 1930s, the New Deal era. So the Great Society is the fourth era of comprehensive legislation, again, attempting to redress some of these social and economic inequities in America. And so the Great Society era really pertains to the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration. So Johnson wanted to build a better society, he says, where progress is the servant of the neediest. That's a quote. Recognizing the political opening generated by the assassination of JFK, Johnson immediately committed himself to Kennedy's agenda for civil rights and social inequity. And in January 1964, he extended upon this agenda by announcing an unconditional war on poverty, which is going to be the hallmark of his Great Society legislation. And we could really understand the Great Society era within this tradition of large government expenditures, particularly from left-wing politicians. And Johnson himself considered himself a passionate New Dealer, meaning that he's following in the footsteps of politicians like FDR, among other progressive politicians from the early 20th century. Between 1964 and 1968, under the Johnson administration, more than 60 Great Society programs were put in place. Most sought to provide better economic and social opportunities by removing barriers thrown up by health, education, region, and racial difference, particularly racism in America. So throughout this era, we see different bodies of legislation responding to the social and economic inequity in America by the mid 20th century. And like the New Deal legislation, a lot of these programs are still with us and really have changed the structure of American society across the 20th century and even till today. So the first aspect of Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society programs pertain to the demands of the civil rights movement. For example, the Civil Rights Act in 1964 provided protection for voters, voting rights, particularly in the South, where voting rights were barred due to racial discrimination, religion, and gender. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, voter registration rates in the South increased at an average of 67% from 1964 to 1968. And in 1970, there were 1,400 Black elected officials in the United States. By November 2011, there were more than 11,000. So in a way, we can see this as a second Reconstruction. If we look at it particularly in terms of the numbers of Black officials elected as a result of legislation, it is definitely a second Reconstruction. That's why many historians consider this Great Society legislation as a kind of second Reconstruction. Also, we'll be talking about this next week. As with the first Reconstruction in the 1870s, there is a very vehement backlash, or what some historians and scholars have considered a white lash, in terms of regressive political stances responding to Great Society programs like the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So we'll be talking about that next week. The 24th Amendment, the Constitution in 1964, in addition to the Civil Rights Act in 1964, also bans poll taxes. Now, if we think back to the establishment of Jim Crow power structures in the South, poll taxes were one of these pillars of Jim Crow, which limited Black votership and increased the power of white supremacy. And then, of course, there's also the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, in addition to banning poll taxes, also outlawed Southern literacy tests, which was another limitation, a barrier restricting Black citizenship in the South. The Voting Rights Act of 1964 also authorized federal supervision of Southern elections, so that Southern politicians and officials were less likely to undercut a lot of these federal supervisions and federal protections. The war on poverty, however, was really the meat and potatoes of the Great Society package. As its name suggests, the war on poverty really targeted economic inequality in American society, which Johnson considered deeply implicated with the racial struggle in 1960s America. Between 1965 and 1968, spending to help poor people doubled, and within 10 years, the percentage of Americans living below the poverty line declined from 20% to only 12%. So in a way, the war on poverty was tremendously effective in mitigating the disparity of wealth and poverty in America. But the war on poverty was a comprehensive package of legislation which had multiple elements. For example, elements pertaining to education inequality, also healthcare inequality, also in environmental devastation. This is all part of the war on poverty package that Johnson oversaw. And as with the New Deal, a lot of the programs that Johnson initiated are still with us. For example, the Head Start program, first funded in 1965, provided federal funds for preschool programs, also serving more than 31 million children since 1965, which was a tremendous impact over time. The Higher Education Act of 1964 is another example of this interest in enhancing equality in terms of education, wherein between 1963 and 1964, nearly $900 million in federal grants were given to students, almost all veterans or members of military families, and more than $900 million also doled out in student loans to provide families, especially the families with lower socioeconomic status, the financial means to send their children to college. Healthcare is another pillar of the Great Society legislation. So the Johnson administration creates Medicaid and Medicare. These are two programs that remain with us. And in a way, these two programs are directly related to the New Deal era politics in the way that it amends the Social Security Act. So what these two programs do is they subsidize healthcare for elderly and low-income individuals and families. For example, in 1966, nearly 20 million, all of them elderly, people were enrolled in Medicare. In 1975, about 22 million people were served by Medicaid. So in a way, the Johnson administration is tying disparities of wealth and income with disparities in terms of healthcare as well. He's saying that all these aspects of inequality are interrelated, and the only way to enhance social equality is to address all of these different aspects, whether that be racial discrimination or disparities in terms of healthcare providers. Johnson also sees environmental degradation as another aspect of social inequity. So, through a series of legislation and laws, the Great Society is attempting to implement structural change that is supposed to protect environmental conservation. Of course, Nixon passes the Environmental Protection Act, establishing the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. But really, we can understand the EPA as building on the environmental pillars of the Great Society legislation under the Johnson administration. The Great Society also targeted arts and media in the legislation as well. So they created programs like Public Broadcasting Service and NPR. And again, these are two programs that also remain with us today. So the goal of these programs are to educate the populace, but also provide government funding to broadcast services that are going to establish a connection between the majority of Americans and their government, primarily by providing assistance for non-commercial television and radio. Urban housing was a central focus of the Great Society legislation, particularly public housing. So the Omnibus Housing Bill of 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson considered this the, quote, the single most important breakthrough in housing since the New Deal. And in years to come, he believed the act will become known as the single most important housing legislation in American history. So this was monumental for the Johnson administration and monumental for the Great Society legislation that was passed under the Johnson administration. So what this bill did was allocate nearly $8 billion to public housing, which provided for rent subsidies for low-income people to live, also new public housing projects to be constructed throughout America. And again, I just want to stress the way in which the Johnson administration configured wealth and social inequality in America in the way that it entailed multiple different aspects, whether that be inequality based on education or healthcare or housing. These are all elements creating poverty in America, according to the Johnson administration. So these different pillars of the Great Society legislation are all responding to structural components that are contributing to poverty. So the last pillar of inequality that I want to address regarding the Great Society legislation is immigration. So the Immigration Act in 1965 really overturns a lot of the racism that was sewn into immigration policy from the early 20th century. So it abolishes the national origins formula. If we think about the early 20th century and the way in which the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Johnson Quota Act of 1921 established these racial quotas based on limiting immigration from non-white countries. The Immigration Act in 1965 really overturns a lot of these precedents. So we can say that the New Deal, Great Society legislation really liberalizes immigration policy in America, meaning that preference was no longer given to immigrants from European countries, i.e. white immigrants, and this policy increased immigration from Asia, Africa, and other non-white countries throughout the world. So it really changes the composition of American society by opening up America's borders to immigrants who had subsequently been denied immigration or otherwise were restricted in terms of the number of non-white citizens coming to America. We're not going to switch gears from talking about the structural changes in American society. Now we're going to talk about some of the forms of agency, the ground. One of the figureheads of the second wave feminism is a intellectual named Betty Friedan, who publishes a book called The Feminine Mystique in 1963. And so this is a book that becomes a national bestseller. And essentially what Friedan is saying is that women are capable of more than the stereotypical gender roles prescribed to them by commercial advertisements and television. Friedan goes on to become a figurehead of feminism during the 1960s and creates the National Organization of Women, a organization which it becomes the vanguard for gender equality in America during the 1960s and 70s. So Betty Friedan is the president of this organization, and their goal is to fight discrimination, but also the end goal of this organization is to establish the Equal Rights Constitutional Amendment, essentially creating a structural change in American society to provide gender equality once and for all in American society, to ensure gender equality, erase access to birth control devices, easier access to birth control devices, and right to have abortion. All of these are part of the Equal Rights Constitutional Amendment, but also to remove a lot of the structural barriers that are in place in America during this time that are restricting the power of women. And this is important because a lot of the structural components of the Johnson administration showed little interest in focusing on women's rights and discrimination. So this becomes the forefront of gender equality and in terms of the disparate activist groups that we're going to be talking about. The gay rights movement is also contemporaneous with the second wave feminism, where women's and gay rights made gender equality and homosexuality more acceptable in American society. And so there's a lot of overlap between these two activist movements. Looking back, historians focus on the Stonewall riots as the real catalyst of the gay rights movement. So the Stonewall riot, or Stonewall uprising in 1969, refers to a bar in lower Manhattan where New York City police attempted to arrest various clientele. And we can see this kind of crackdown, as it were, on gay nightlife as a continuation of the vice squads and the constrictive social policies of the Eisenhower administration. However, in 1969 at Stonewall, the clientele resist their arrest and essentially stage an impromptu demonstration against police repression of gay nightlife. Thereafter, the Stonewall uprising becomes a flashpoint for the gay rights movement that subsequently inspired other demonstrations across the country through the 1970s and 1980s. When we talk about the counterculture in the 1960s, we're talking about popular culture primarily in the way popular culture popularized drug use, provided a soundtrack for protest groups, and also encouraged sexual liberation. And all of these factors galvanized protest movements in the 1960s and the early 1970s in very distinct ways. The popularization of rock and roll provided a soundtrack in the way in which music attacked corporate structures and corporate motives of government agencies. The popularization of marijuana and LSD enhanced spiritual or quote unquote spiritual liberation and anti-capitalist ethics among American youth in the 1960s. And sexual liberation exposed that women were increased to sexual assaults as well. So a lot of these repercussions were not necessarily transforming society in a progressive way, but in some ways were instead regressive. So sexual liberation, thought to be undermining the constrictive gender roles, actually increased sexual violence towards women. But nonetheless, all of these pillars of the counterculture really galvanized social protest in America, and we can see this particularly with the New Left movement. Within the civil rights movement, feminist movement, gay rights movements, young college-age adults were among the loudest and most militant calling for change. And these are the actors that are at the forefront of the New Left movement. So when we talk about the new left movement, we're talking about a cohort of American college-age activists that are collectively responding to the restrictive social norms and policies of the Eisenhower administration, the Eisenhower America. By the middle of the 1960s, Students for a Democratic Society is an organization of young college-age activists who in 1962 outlined their agenda for social change in the Port Huron Statement, which we can read as a kind of utopian manifesto in which these activists are striving to build, quote, an environment for people to live in with dignity and creativeness. So by the end of the 1960s, the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, one of the leading catalysts of social change among the various protest groups on left-wing politics. So Students for Democratic Society hold teach-ins, raising consciousness about class and social issues that are afflicting most Americans by the 1960s. Also staging draft card burnings. And this is a pillar of activist tactics during the 1960s. And it was responding to something we talked about last week, which is essentially the anti-war movement, how the anti-war movement really brings together the various social issues and critiques with American foreign policy as it relates to domestic policy. And the SDS are really the front runners of the anti-war movement. So through staging teach-ins and draft card burnings, the SDS really galvanizes the anti-war movement. So essentially what draft card burning means is that white middle-class students could defer draft lottery, whereas lower class non-white students were more vulnerable to the draft. And so the SDS is really responding to the Vietnam War in the way it disproportionately draws from lower class communities of color for the draft, sending non-white youth to fight foreign policy that is supporting capitalism. So by 1965, while blacks accounted for only 12% of the American population, blacks made up nearly 50% of the frontline forces in the Vietnam War and accounted for nearly 25% of the combat deaths among American soldiers in Vietnam. So the SDS is bringing to focus Vietnam as not only a foreign policy conundrum, but also a symptom of the larger domestic issues in America, particularly regarding racial inequality and economic inequality as well. Civil rights and Black Power leaders like Stokely Carmichael and Martin Luther King begin to denounce the Vietnam War. King called the war immoral and preached that the Great Society has been shot down by the battlefields of Vietnam. He stated that it was wrong to send young blacks to defend democracy in Vietnam when they're denied democracy in southern states like Georgia. So as civil rights transitions into the Black Power era, we can also think of the Black Power movement as part of these social activist movements in the 1960s and 70s in the way they align themselves with activist groups like SDS. Generally, the Johnson administration dismissed a lot of these what they considered radical activist movements like SDS or even the Black Panthers and the Black Power Party, Black Power movement. It's important to know that these are only a few examples of the movements on the left in the 1960s and 70s, that there are other examples like agricultural labor movement led by activists like Cesar Chavez. But generally during the 1960s and 70s, we see, again, another proliferation of social movements that are responding to the social and economic inequality in America. Next week, we're going to talk about a reciprocal cohort of movements from the right-wing politics.